Hello, people. Today I'm doing a tier list of my favorite director of all time, Christopher Nolan. I believe I made a ranking a couple years ago when Tenet came out. I have not watched that ranking since. I am sure it's completely different now. Before we do this, just remember my opinion on Christopher Nolan is always changing, and it's never bad changing. It's always just changing, because I can love The Dark Knight more than Dunkirk one day, or I can love Dunkirk more than The Dark Knight one day. And that doesn't mean that either movie is worse. It just depends on the day of which one I like more. Don't say, oh my god, you think this movie's worse than this? It's all very much on a thin line for almost every single one of his movies because I love all of his movies very much. Here's the thing, that'd make the tier list kind of boring if I just gave it all S in like maybe one or two A and maybe like one B. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give it a grade based off a Christopher Nolan film. So the movie could be like a 5-star movie for me, but I could put it in A or B. So I'm gonna really just try and judge it as a Christopher Nolan movie. How is this as a Christopher Nolan experience? How is this of what I expect out of a filmmaker like him? So it's gonna be a little bit more harsh than usual, but keep in mind that I love these movies to death. So first movie is Batman Begins. Batman Begins is Christopher Nolan's very first attempt at making a blockbuster, wide-scale type film, and obviously that's something that he got really, really good at, but I don't think he was really good at it in this movie. Yes, there are elements here that really work, but some core elements to what make a Christopher Nolan movie are missing here. And that is decent looking choreography, and maybe it's not even the choreography, it's just the way that the action sequences that are edited in this movie, because there's a lot of quick cuts, you can barely see what's going on, and it's just shocking when you go to The Dark Knight and Dark Knight Rises when you see everything in a nice, beautiful wide with an IMAX camera. It's night and day with sequences like that. I do think this is a very well written movie. I think it has a lot of Christopher Nolan grand philosophy that you get in the other movies like The Dark Knight and Dark Knight Rises. And so in that way you can definitely tell on paper that it's a Christopher Nolan movie. But at face value, at a surface look, if I muted the entire movie and didn't hear a word they were saying, I might have not known that this was a Christopher Nolan movie. There's a lot of really solid practical effects, particularly with the Batmobile, but there are some things that I don't think necessarily age well from a Batman action perspective, but still a very solid origin story that kind of redefined the form of what a Batman movie can be and what a superhero movie can be. So for those reasons, I'm going to give it a B on the Christopher Nolan scale or whatever. Next up is The Prestige. The first time I really liked it, and then the second time I loved it, but I don't think it's quite there for what I go for a Christopher Nolan experience. This movie is still fantastic. It has a lot of that grand Christopher Nolan philosophy, and this movie is a lot more twisty and turny compared to a movie like Batman Begins or The Dark Knight. This movie has a lot on its mind philosophically and with its story because its characters and its dynamics are quite complex, and its twist is almost one of the best twists ever put to film. I don't really have a lot to complain about with this movie. It's just there's not necessarily a lot that I think is like extraordinary with this movie. Yes, there's a good twist. Yes, there's fantastic performances. Yes, it's really well written, but there's not necessarily a thing that like drives me to go to rewatch just like I do some other movies. So for those reasons, I'm gonna give The Prestige. I'm in between A or B. I'm gonna put it in high B above Batman Begins. Next up is Tenet. If you're a Christopher Nolan fan and you want to see what kind of Christopher Nolan fan that person is, you ask their opinion on Tenet, and I think that'll tell you basically what kind of Nolan fan they are. There's a lot of Nolan fans that will just go straight to D tier, and there's a lot of Christopher Nolan fans that'll be like, it's fine in C tier, but usually I'd say about 60% would put it here. That other 40% would probably put it, or 39% would probably put it in B. I'm part of that 1% that wants to put it in S. I love Tenet. I love this movie to death, and I will defend it all day long. Tenet is, I know people describe Oppenheimer as Nolan's magnum opus, and I understand that, but I think in a lot of ways Tenet is, because it's not accessible. It's not necessarily a fun movie to watch the first time. Heck, it gives you one horrible headache the first time you watch it, and it makes you never want to watch a movie again. But go back, you go back, and you study the thing, and it makes sense. People are gonna say, "Oh, it's dumb." Christopher Nolan doesn't even know what it's about. There's things out here that make so many plot holes and blah 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 blah. Blah. There really isn't. I mean, there things are that I just know every question has an answer if you just watch the movie again. And I think everything is there. I think this movie really is a jigsaw puzzle that Christopher Nolan wants us to solve. It's not necessarily going to make all that much sense. And yes, I can get back the agreements of if the story is this so complex, why do you have to make the character dynamics so difficult to understand sometimes? That's the only complaint I can really see with Tenet. But at the same time, it's just part of this beautiful puzzle that is this movie. I don't care about things being complex. If I can break it down, I can break it down. If it's difficult to break down, sure, go ahead, I'll try. I don't want to talk about Tenet for too long because I am famous for making this video way too long. Tenet's great. I love it. It's amazing. Okay. Dark Knight Rises. This is the most times I've ever seen a movie in theaters. So there might be some bias in that way, but I am going to give it a Christopher Nolan A because yes, I don't want to call it Christopher Nolan's fan servicey movie. It has some issues that I can honestly get behind, particularly with Talia, some of the Bane's plans and some of the stuff that just doesn't really make sense of why they are there. But Batman Begins is still a incredibly emotional, grand spectacle that Christopher Nolan made with the movie. I think what this movie really strives for is progressing the character of Bruce Wayne and really being in his psychological state because we spend a lot of time with Bruce Wayne in this movie. This movie is almost 3 hours long, and we spend a lot of time with him, and there's not much Batman in this movie. But I honestly think that's what we needed for a final installment. I was 8 years old when this movie came out, and I saw it 3 times in theaters willingly. I asked to go 3 times. Not I was made to go 3 times. I asked to go 3 times. That hasn't happened with a movie since, besides one other movie that's actually on this list. Yeah, I think The Dark Knight Rises, while it's not perfect on paper, there's some things that are little like logic gaps that don't make entirely sense. That's not what the movie's going for, and I think people completely misunderstand that. Well, I think that The Dark Knight kind of goes for almost trying to be perfect with its story and plot. Dark Knight Rises is going for something completely different. So complaining like with things like that don't necessarily make sense to me. I can't say what a movie's goal is because I didn't make the movie. So, anyways, next up is Following. This is D tier Nolan. Easily, want to know why? It's a student film. It's gonna be kind of crappy. I mean, it's not even crappy. It's a fantastic student film, but when compared to the other movies on here, like yeah, it's crappy. It seems rather unfocused compared to Christopher Nolan's other movies. There's some character dynamics that just don't make any sense. There's some twists that just seem to be there because twist reasons, but it's still a solidly constructed movie that has a lot on its mind. It just doesn't know exactly where to place them. The movie's okay in my opinion, so D tier sounds very harsh, but remember this is the Christopher Nolan tier list. So I'm being harsh on purpose. Next up is Memento. I'm back and forth with this. I actually don't know where I'm going to put this. I know. So Memento, the first time I watched Memento, I would have given it A tier, probably right around there. I rewatched it again recently, and this is one of the few Christopher Nolan movies that don't do this. Usually, when I watch a Christopher Nolan movie, I like it 1,000 times more on rewatch. Memento was one of those movies where the rewatch was good. I didn't like it anymore. I didn't dislike it any less. I just thought it was a good rewatch, and the movie was exactly how I remembered. And so, for those reasons, I'm gonna lower it down to B tier, in between The Prestige and Batman Begins. Memento is definitely screenplay wise like fantastic because it gets a lot down for Nolan's career. Heck, it gets him a best screenplay nomination at the Oscars and on a $6 million budget. Like, how is that not impressive? The way that it goes backwards and forwards and black and white, it's definitely very influential for Nolan's careers and even for movies like Oppenheimer that we see now. So it is definitely undeniably a movie that impacted him immensely. Is it a movie I want to go rewatch every single day? God, no. I cannot really rewatch this movie. In fact, I mean, this and Following, I think, are like the most hard to rewatch just because once you see through Mementos, I don't want to call it a gimmick, but through its thing that it does, it's pretty simple a movie. It doesn't really have much going on it besides that, but what's going on is so complex, it's hard to follow. You know, when you're trying to wrap your brain around it, it's almost good that it's as simple as it is. But once I feel like you see past that idea, it's a little hard to break through to the movie any more than you already have. Next up is Dunkirk. I love Dunkirk. I've argued about this movie with people because I think it is fantastic, and people try to tell me this movie is boring. And my question is how? How can you find Dunkirk boring? It is enthralling from beginning to end. Something's always happening. It's a very short script, only 47 pages, and it is just, I think, a very well made movie, a very well acted movie, even though there's very little character in this movie. But that's another thing that people misunderstand about this movie. A lot of people say, oh, there's no character, no character development, none of that. I think this movie is definitely a lot more about the event and the emotion behind that besides just our characters. We follow so many characters so we can understand the gravitas of this grand event that was the tragedy of Dunkirk. And so when you see all these things come together at the end and Christopher Nolan messing with time, you really feel that emotion of this grand scale event, and I don't think it really would have worked if it was just following one guy the entire time. So I'm gonna put Dunkirk pretty high. I'm gonna give it A tier on above Dark Knight Rises. Okay, next up, Interstellar. This is my favorite movie of all time, so we all know it's just gonna go to here. Interstellar. I know this is the Interstellar being my favorite movie is something I've become kind of like self-aware of lately because I know Interstellar is like the ultimate film bro favorite movie. Like I understand why people want to make fun of it in that way, but at the same time, it is still a fantastic movie and my favorite movie. And I don't want to think I'm a film bro. I mean, I don't put my opinion above others, and I'm not afraid to say a new movie is fantastic. So I don't think that makes me a film bro, but having Interstellar as my favorite movie makes me think that for some reason. But Interstellar, I think, is a masterpiece, and I'll give you reasons why it's my favorite movie because I tell everyone the same reason every time. What I think a great movie should do is give you grand scale spectacle and at the same time give you grand scale emotion. Usually, a movie goes for one or the other. It usually goes for a lot of emotion at small scale, or it goes for big explosions and not really much going on with the characters. And so that's why we have a lot of Marvel movies, and then we have a lot of movies like what's a movie with small budget and a lot of Manchester by the Sea. This movie is Manchester by the Sea plus Avengers and well, more like plus Guardians of the Galaxy. I mean, they're completely different, and it's definitely more tone connected to Manchester by the Sea, but I'm not trying to say it's really like any of those movies. It's not like either one of those movies. Interstellar is its own thing because it combines those two elements and makes a movie because there's not very often where you watch a movie and you look at an explosion and you are awestruck because you're not really connected to the characters and what's going on. And so when you watch space and Interstellar and you're so connected to the story and this message about humanity and what these characters and what they're going through, and when you connect to them as characters and then you see these grand scale events, you really just feel it so much more. And when Nolan, what he goes for is practicality, and he applies those to scenes, and when you they feel so, as real as they are, and they're shot in beautiful IMAX, and plus you almost want to cry for these characters the entire time. It just becomes a like full body levitating human experience because I have never watched a movie like I've watched Interstellar for the first time where I just look at it and I just feel like, whoa. Because I was 10 years old when this movie came out. I saw it in theaters and I was stricken from beginning to end. It just grabbed me. It didn't let me go for the entire 3 hour runtime. Interstellar to this day is like the best theatrical experience I've ever had. It's a movie I'll never forget watching for the first time. And I was 10 years old when it came out. And I wasn't like 8 year old, 10-year old who liked slow burn movies. It's just the Christopher Nolan 3 hour movies I just somehow liked, and I didn't even know they were directed by the same person. Anyways, next movie, The Dark Knight. The Dark Knight is the best comic book movie of all time, one of my favorite movies of all time, and so it's definitely going to go up in S tier, right below Interstellar. The Dark Knight is the movie of all time. If Interstellar didn't exist, The Dark Knight would probably be my number one. My number two is The Shining, and number three is Dark Knight. And The Shining, I just don't think matches my personality as much as I think The Dark Knight does. I just don't want to have two Christopher Nolan movies next to each other. The Dark Knight, I watched this again recently, and my stance on the movie hasn't changed at all. But I showed it to someone who hasn't seen the movie before, and that's the first time I've done that, shown The Dark Knight to someone who hasn't seen it because everyone's seen The Dark Knight, right? But no, I found someone who hasn't seen it, and we watched it, and it was almost like I was seeing the movie for the first time again. Because when you show someone a movie, you don't want to say anything, you hold things back, you feel the tension again because you know of what's about to happen, and it almost made me re-experience the movie because I grew up watching The Dark Knight. The movie came out in 2008. I was born in 2004. I was 4 years old when it came out. I definitely didn't see it in theaters, or else that would have traumatized me from a very young age. I don't even remember the first time I watched this movie because I watched it so much when I was little once it came out on DVD. It was just a movie that was always on when I was a kid, and so I was almost spoiled by it. I didn't necessarily appreciate these things because, when you grow up and your dad's Tom Cruise, you don't really appreciate the fact that your dad is Tom Cruise because it's all you've ever known. So that was kind of my case with The Dark Knight until I watched it again a couple weeks ago, showing it to someone who hasn't seen it before, and I was like, "Oh my god, this movie really is that good." I mean, it's still like on my list of where it is, and it hasn't moved, but it just reinstated my thoughts on the movie and made it even more definitely number two. Next up is Inception. I think with what Christopher Nolan's done within the last 10 or so years has almost, I don't want to say hurt Inception, but it made it seem a little bit less special. But it is still a very special movie to Christopher Nolan's filmography because it introduced a lot of grand spectacle ideas, but yet really intertwined these complex philosophical thoughts into his movies. And so it was really, and it made a lot of money. So it was very, very important that this movie was just almost perfect with reception, its making. Obviously, Christopher Nolan just, I don't want to say repeated Inception, but if it weren't for Inception, he wouldn't have been allowed to make Interstellar. He wouldn't have been allowed to make, I think this movie really, really roller coastered it. But the thing is about Inception is I think his future movies, I don't want to say they're single handedly better, but I think movies like Dunkirk, Interstellar, and Tenet, and even Oppenheimer took some of the things that Inception laid down and improved on them. So when you go back to Inception, it's like, yeah, this is great, but you did this too, and I'd rather see that again. So I still think Inception is pretty much a masterpiece, and I'm gonna put it in. Dang, I'm gonna put it in A tier, right below Dunkirk. I think. Is that where I want to put it? I might change it by the time this list is over. It's really back and forth with Dunkirk. It depends. You ask me on a different day, I'll like part of me wants to say Dunkirk's better, but now part of me is thinking Inception's better. I'm just gonna put it right there or right there. I don't know. Anyways, next up is Insomnia. Insomnia is that one movie that I don't even know if it counts. And that's mostly because it's like you didn't write the thing. I mean, Christopher Nolan's direction is definitely there, and you can definitely feel that a very skilled filmmaker was making this movie. But at the same time, a lot of Christopher Nolan's sense is in his dialogue and his big philosophy. And this movie didn't necessarily have a lot of that. I mean, there is definitely great lines. Al Pacino's great. Robin Williams is great. Everyone's great in the movie. Christopher Nolan's direction is still very strong, but it doesn't necessarily feel like a very big Christopher Nolan movie. Yeah, I mean, I guess that's my only real complaint. I've only seen this movie one time, and it's not necessarily one that I want to revisit, and I do remember it well. On the Christopher Nolan scale, I'm going to put it in B tier. I don't know if I want to put it above Batman Begins or not because I think I'll put it above Batman Begins. Yeah, that feels right. Okay, lastly is Oppenheimer, the newest Christopher Nolan film. This came out about a month ago, about a month and a half ago, and it definitely had an effect on me, as you can see. Yeah, I got the screenplay too. I read all 220 pages of it. It was a glorious 220 pages, and I am seeing it again tomorrow. But that also means something very special because that also means that it would be tied with Dark Knight Rises with the most amount of times I've seen a film in theaters. The reason why I'm seeing it again in theaters is because my IMAX was just redone. It's no longer a regular IMAX, it's IMAX laser. So, and it's one of the last showings of Oppenheimer. I was like, dang, I should really see it again. So I would say with Dark Knight Rises, it is a little bit more special. If my IMAX theater wasn't redone, I wouldn't be seeing it for a third time. But anyway, I'm still gonna put Oppenheimer in S tier because it's still one of his best movies. If it's better than Tenet, I mean, I'm back and forth. I'll probably know better tomorrow, which is probably bad timing to even make this video, but whatever, I'm doing it now. But I'm really back and forth whether it's Tenet or Oppenheimer. I mean, most people think I'm stupid for even considering this and probably telling me it's obviously Oppenheimer. Like, heck, look, the poster I have behind me. I think Oppenheimer, there's still things in Oppenheimer that just slightly bug me that don't want me to put it in front of Tenet. But at the same time, by my third viewing of Tenet, there was a lot of things that bugged me that I just needed to, see past. But I don't know if there's some certain things in Oppenheimer because it's not things that confuse me. Like things in Oppenheimer, I mean, my smallest nitpick with the movie is that as soon as the Trinity test happens, it feels like we're dove right into courtroom drama right again, and it feels like it's like a little too swift and it didn't slow down enough for me. But I mean, the movie's already 3 hours, so I mean, could I ask it to slow down anymore? I mean, that's how you know these movies are good because I am agonizing over small nitpicks about them because I don't know, maybe by tomorrow Oppenheimer will be above Tenet. Right now, this is where I'm at. A month you can check my letterboxd again and it could be completely different. In fact, I'm not even sure if I have Inception where I have it on here because I honestly cannot remember. I just know they're right next to each other. Let's find out if I was right because part of me is saying put Inception above Dunkirk, but I guarantee you I'm going to check it and be wrong. Wait, I was right. Yeah. Inception above Dunkirk. Yeah, yeah, okay. I was right. Well, on my third guess, I was right. Yeah, that is the Christopher Nolan list. This is my second time making this video, and each time I want to make it about a 10-minute video, but I guarantee you it's going to be more like a 20-minute video because I just cannot stop talking about Christopher Nolan. I love this guy. He's my favorite filmmaker, and he will continue to be my favorite filmmaker. Maybe I guess this is a good time to say this. If Dune Part 2 is better than Oppenheimer, I'm gonna claim Denis Villeneuve or Denis Villeneuve. However you say his last name, no one could say his last name consistently for me to know which one is right. If Dune Part 2, if I like it more than Oppenheimer, I'm gonna go ahead and say he's my favorite filmmaker. But for as of right now, Christopher Nolan still got it because I'm right off the heels of Oppenheimer, but we'll see. I'll know for sure like in July of next year. Once Dune 2 has been out for a couple months and I've kind of chilled out from that. So yeah, comment down below what you guys thought of this tier list. It's very curious to see what kind of Christopher Nolan fans everyone else is. So yeah, anyways, like, share, subscribe, and stuff like that. And adios.